Good Shabbos, everyone. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
We just finished Vayechi, and he lived the portion that ends the book of Genesis. In this portion, it records the last years and death of Jacob. Jacob's request of Joseph to be buried in Eretz Yisrael in the cave of Machpelah, where his parents Isaac and Rebekah and his grandparents Abraham and Sarah are buried. He adopts his grandchildren Manasseh and Ephraim, transmitting the blessing not to any of his children, but to his grandchildren Manasseh and Ephraim. And in doing so, he also elevates the younger Ephraim over Manasseh. He calls all of his sons to his bedside to offer final words to them. Jacob dies and is embalmed. An official Egyptian delegation, entourage, accompanies his son to Eretz Yisrael. The sons collectively bury him in the cave of Machpelah. Joseph's brothers, wallowing still in guilt, suspect Joseph might punish them for their actions decades earlier, now that their father has died. Joseph not only reassures them, he promises to care for them and their families. Joseph lives to 110 and dies, but he tells his family that God will return them to Eretz Yisrael and instructs them to carry his bones up from Egypt at that time. So in thinking about all of this, I want us first to consider, and I ask, how does this chapter conclude Genesis? What ties to the rest of the book do you see in it? In these closing chapters of Genesis, what ties it and what serves as a conclusion? Hopefully a good conclusion, but you don't have to agree that's the best literary conclusion. Just how does it tie up Genesis? Josh.
So, not quite Bereshit, but a little bit in. We get Cain and Abel, where Cain murders Abel. It's like, I'm my brother's keeper. And then here at the end of Genesis, have an affirmation that, yes, I am my brother's keeper. I am the keeper of my brothers and their lineage.
Fabulous. So whereas at the very beginning, chapter 4 of Genesis, Cain murders his brother, and we wonder what's going to become of humanity if this is the way of the world, that we don't like something about somebody, so we kill them. And by the end of it, Joseph promises to take care of his brothers and their children and their lineage. And so we have a sense that at least there's a possibilities for families to reconcile and to be healthy and functional. Thank you. Anybody else see anything towards the end of Genesis that helps tie up or in some way conclude something else from Genesis? Oh, yes, am I on?
God tells Abraham to go to the land of Israel. That's how the Jewish people got started. And although Joseph and his brothers are still stuck in Egypt, the book ends by saying, one day we're going to go back. We're going to go back to Canaan.
Nice, beautiful. So God has made this promise to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, that you get to inherit Eretz Yisrael. You might think because they're in Egypt that somehow there's a loose end. But no, at the very end, Joseph in the last verse, basically, or last couple verses, promises that everybody will return to Eretz Yisrael, which is what God promised. Very good call. Excellent. Anybody else see a connection? So there are many, right? In chapter 50, verse 1, where he kisses him, it reminds us of Esau kissing Jacob when they reconcile. It reminds us, in fact, of the recognition scene where Joseph kisses Benjamin and his brothers and sisters. And to have that be the ending, sort of at the end, the idea of kissing our family is a really, really important thing. We also have in 50, verse 17, the concern for forgiveness. and which has been scattered throughout the book of Genesis. We also have the theme of recognizing God, which began with Abraham's journey in Genesis 12. And here we're told to recognize God in verse 17. In chapter 50, verse 24, we mentioned the avot, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, very, very specifically. And of course, much of Genesis has been the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As Josh mentioned, the rivalry of the human family, among birth family at least, became rivalry among the human family when it came to Sodom and Gomorrah, and now all of that seems to be overcome here. We have the theme of exile and return that Mayan hinted at. We also have the theme of what makes for Jewishness and what is the divide between acculturation and assimilation. Many of our ancestors intermarry, but none of them, until Joseph, seemed to give up a lot of their Jewishness. In fact, if anything, the intermarriage strengthens the Jewish people. What you have, though, Joseph alone, who seems to be fully integrated into his Egyptian landscape. In 50 verse 25, he's clearly Egyptian. He even gets embalmed, which is an Egyptian custom and not a Jewish one. But he clearly considers himself an Israelite because he wishes to be buried in Eretz Israel in the family plot. We also have family matters. And that's really an important part of this. We have Abraham, the terrifying distant father, who sees only the vision and willing to do all for it. We have Isaac, enigmatic, victimized, yet perhaps clever manipulator, masking as a doddering old fool, a quiet man who carries the scars of the traumatic event where his father nearly killed him. We have Jacob, a mercenary ambition when young, but grows into the role of a patriarch. The two, like his parents, seems to be a lousy father, ignoring most of his children and favoring the few he pays attention to. And Joseph finally starts off the spoiled brat, who's the cause of his own misfortunes, but who has the guile and adaptability to rise to the top. Meanwhile, we have the women who are seemingly props and property, but actually, when you look at them, they're very smart, they're clever, and they're the ones who very effectively affect the course of human history, and certainly Jewish history. We also have 49:29, which mentions the field of Ephron the Hittite, which brings up a number of themes: honoring the dead, interfaith relations, the connection of commerce and culture, and our being bound to Eretz Israel. So now that we have that piece of connecting this parsha to Genesis, I'd like us also to take a moment, because it's not only the end of the book, in some ways it sets up the stage for the book of Exodus. So who can think of a connection between this portion in particular and the book of Exodus? Anybody have a thought on how this... Mayan, you have a thought?
They never went back to Canaan. They're still in Egypt. And when we began Exodus, we are still in Egypt.
Fantastic. So they are still in Egypt. In fact, the last word of the entire book of Genesis is B'Mitzrayim, right? So they are in Egypt. And obviously, when we begin the story of Exodus, it's about the oppression in Egypt. So it sets us up very, very well. Anybody else have a thought? Well, Genesis 49, Jacob speaks to each of his children, the gathered brothers, and the beginning of Exodus reminds us of all those brothers coming to Egypt. And they end up becoming the eponymous tribes of Israel, which become significant in Exodus only. In 50, 24, and 25, it says, God will surely take note of you. In Exodus 3:16, that becomes a rallying cry for the entire Exodus story. In 50:25, there's the oath to bring up Joseph's bones, and that's carried out in Exodus 13:19. He seems to be buried, Joseph, in a plot that Jacob once bought in Shechem, which not only did we read about in Genesis 33, but becomes important in the Joshua story ahead. A coffin in Egypt foreshadows the period of enslavement, where the Israelite male babies will be killed. But it also portends promise, as Moshe too will be placed in a coffin-like basket on the Nile, which saves him. Mitzrayim, Egypt, has been a major character in the book of Genesis, but it becomes even more important and more symbolic as a symbol in Exodus. The rivalry among birth family will become a rivalry among the human family in Egypt, as Egyptians and Jews are at each other. When Jacob gives his last words to his sons, he only directly addresses two of them. The others he talks about in the third person about them, even though they're in front of him. He directly addresses only Joseph and Judah. The Joseph tribes, especially Ephraim, become the dominant tribe in the northern country of Israel, while Judah becomes the dominant tribe in the southern country of Judah. Finally, this parsha is the only one in the entire Torah that begins in the middle of a paragraph, perhaps indicating that we are still in the middle of a very important foundational story of our people. So we've concluded the book of Genesis, just had a quick look back at it. We look forward to Exodus Shemot. And now I want us to take a step back for our own lives. We're approaching the new year 2022, and we're invited to look back and to look forward in our own lives. But I'm going to ask you, from now that we've finished the book of Genesis, what lessons does the book of Genesis in general and Parshat Vayechi in particular give as a gift to us as we end one year and confront a new one? Any thoughts on lessons we might have learned? Yes. Revenge is what?
A sucker's game.
Revenge is a sucker's game. Thank you, Esther. Yes. Revenge might feel sweet in the moment, but it never really pays off. And its sweetness seems to dissipate pretty quickly when you realize what its effect is. So thank you. So we got to watch ourselves from revenge, whether it's physical revenge, emotional revenge, oral revenge, whatever it is. Alma. Forgiveness. Fantastic. One of the things we learn is forgiveness, which Joseph models so well, and Jacob seems to model as well with his children. So the idea of forgiveness as we close out a year and enter a new year is a really, really good one. Yes, Josh.
There's no going backwards, only going forward.
Yes, absolutely. No going backwards. While we can draw lessons and take them with us, there's nothing to be gained by dwelling in the past, right? Some people seem to be stuck sometimes, but we've got to move forward. Yes, Mark.
What's interesting about Oxnard, however, does dwell in the past and does dwell in revenge.
Yes, that's really, really interesting. And I think it was done purposely to point out the greatness of the patriarchs and matriarchs who were able to get beyond. Don't be stuck like David, who is a fountain of dying with thoughts of revenge in his heart, telling people, go take revenge on this person and that person, right? And stay stuck in his past. It shows that he carried around an awful burden all those years of bitterness and resentment against people. That's not a healthy way to end your life, right? To feel like all of your relationships are bitternesses and resentments. Better to have what Jacob sort of seemingly does, and certainly what Joseph does, and that's to live with forgiveness and having no regrets and feeling, done in peace, right? Esther, did I see your hand up?
Deathbed wish. Ask you on your deathbed, go for your sin. You are fired to say nothing.
Yeah, that's right. If somebody asks you to do something that's against Torah, right, you actually cannot do it. So if somebody says, I really want that person offed, you can't just murder them just because you like the person or respect the person. You have to say, no, that is so inappropriate, right? So anytime you're asked to do something, stealing or anything else that is contrary to the values of our tradition, even if it's your parent, actually, you're supposed to respect your parents, right? Kaved et avicha v'ed imecha. but you don't need to respect them when they ask you to do something that's contrary to Torah. So if they ask you to go steal something for them, you are actually supposed to decline. So thank you for that. Anybody else have a thought? Yes. I'm sorry? I guess you figure you won't have any more problems with that person if they're in the grave, I guess. I have no idea why anybody would think that killing somebody, if you're upset with them, is a good idea. That was the recourse. And oftentimes in the cultures around them, the whole family would be in on getting the revenge, right? Judaism tried to limit that by having places of refuge, for example, where people who accidentally killed somebody could go and things like that, to try to limit the possibility of revenge by a family who is maybe rightly upset or hurt, but shouldn't channel that hurt into anger, into revenge, right? So Jewish law tried to limit it. Esther? Oh, Mayan, sorry, I didn't see your hand.
I wanted to answer that question. For me, I feel like you asked, is that you, Alma? You asked why did they think that dying was the best way to get revenge, killing people? I think you're right. Like, it's not, we know that there are much worse punishments than death, but the idea that we want revenge, that train of thought, those tendencies, those thought patterns tend to coincide with the incorrect belief that death is the worst punishment.
I think there is a tendency, right? Even when you're a kid, if somebody doesn't do something you want, you don't want to play with them, you want to hit them, you want to strike them. There is that impulse that needs to be controlled. So thank you. And did I see a hand, Esther? No, Josh.
So one thing I will say, not necessarily defending David, but putting some context. David was a king, and he was instructing his son on maintaining the stability of the kingdom. So there's a certain degree of, this person specifically is, fomenting rebellion or something. But there could be more realpolitik than necessarily anything.
Of course, but there's always other ways to limit the power of a political opponent, right, without murdering them. So in any event, let's get back to the actual focus, which is what are the lessons we can draw for our lives as we enter a new year. So I think we've all concluded that revenge is not the way forward. Phil? Tolerance. Fantastic. And it's not just tolerance, it's learning to live in a really beautiful, deep, rich way with people who are different, right? And who might have a quirk that is different from which we don't have, right? But we probably have quirks that they don't have. And learning to live with each other is a beautiful thing that we need to learn to do. Alma? Mm-hmm. Thank you. So thank you, Alma, being au courant, and that the dialogue is shifted in diversity circles to an inclusion circles, from tolerance to acceptance, growing from mere tolerating somebody. I won't hit them, but I'll tolerate them, to accepting them. I'm going to embrace them. I'm going to find a way to see God's image in them and celebrate them, even though they're different from me. Josh.
So just remember, while we all have our different quirks, we're all made up of the same kind of quirks.
As only a scientist could say, thank you so much. Yes, we have quirks, but we all have the same quirks. Thank you so much. So I think that's a good place for us now, when to think about, our year. And I invite you all to take a moment to think about the lessons you've been learning during this pandemic, some of the highs that you've experienced, some of the lessons you'll take with you, what relationships you want to continue to build on and to grow and to deepen, how Torah has been a thread of our lives and a constant, and our traditions as well, has been a thread and a constant through this pandemic, anchoring us, connecting us together, and how Genesis itself, this past number of a couple of months, has also taught us a lot about life and love and forgiveness and togetherness and acceptance and how to move forward and to build. And so your thoughts are my blessing to you, that all of you this year live in health, live in community, live with connection, live with Torah, live with community. May you go from Michael L'Chayil, from strength to strength, from beauty to beauty, from love to love, and embrace to embrace. I'll look forward to